They called her a liar on that dusty platform. Too old, too desperate, too broken to deserve a second chance. Eleanor Hayes had traveled 1,000 miles for a future that was ripped apart in front of an entire town, her dreams shredded like the contract in that cruel woman's hands. But what they didn't know was that rejection would forge her into something far stronger than a mail-order bride could ever be. This is the story of a woman who refused to disappear, a rancher who saw her worth, and a love born not from desperation, but from fire. Stay until the end, and comment what city you're watching from, so I can see how far Eleanor's story has traveled. The train's whistle cut through the afternoon heat like a promise breaking. Eleanor Hayes stood on the wooden platform of Ash Creek with her worn carpetbag clutched in both hands, her heart hammering beneath the high collar of her only good dress, the blue one with the ivory buttons she'd polished that morning until they gleamed. Around her, the frontier town sprawled in shades of dust and determination, false-fronted buildings that pretended to be more than they were, a wide dirt street rutted by wagon wheels, and beyond it all, the vast Montana sky that seemed to swallow everything beneath it. She was 28 years old. She had traveled alone for 6 days, and she was about to meet the man who would become her husband. Eleanor smoothed her skirts one more time, tucking a strand of dark hair back into the simple bun at the nape of her neck. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of this moment. Everything she'd left behind in Philadelphia, every shame and failure, every closed door and pitying glance, all of it was supposed to end here. New name, new life, new chances. The advertisement had been clear. Respectable woman of good character sought for marriage, must be of sound health and pleasant disposition, age preferably under 25. She'd lied about the age, only by 3 years. It had seemed such a small deception at the time, such a forgivable adjustment when measured against the enormity of her need. Back east, she'd been a seamstress in her aunt's shop until the consumption took the old woman, and suddenly Eleanor was 30 days from eviction with skills no one needed, and a reputation shadowed by her aunt's debts. The agencies that arranged respectable employment wanted younger women. The boarding houses wanted references she didn't have, and the alternative, well, she'd seen enough desperate women disappear into that alternative to know she'd rather die. So when she'd seen Mr. Thomas Garrett's advertisement in the matrimonial news, she'd written back the same day. Her letter had been honest about everything except those 3 years. She'd told him about her education, modest but real, enough to read and write and figure accounts. She told him about her work ethic, her health, her lack of family ties that might complicate a new beginning. She'd even confessed that she wasn't pretty in the conventional sense, but that she knew how to keep a house and had been told she had kind eyes. His response had come 6 weeks later, formal but not unkind. He ran a mercantile in Ash Creek, Montana territory. He was 35, a widower of 2 years, respected in the community. He needed a wife to help with the business, and eventually, God willing, to help raise a family. He'd sent a contract, 2 pages of careful script outlining expectations and responsibilities, and tucked inside a railroad ticket. Eleanor had signed it with a hand that barely shook. Now, standing on this platform, with the sun beating down on her shoulders and the other passengers dispersing into the arms of waiting families, she searched the scattered crowd for a face that might be his. She had no photograph, only a description: tall, dark-haired, clean-shaven, likely to be wearing a town suit rather than ranch clothes. "Miss Hayes?" Eleanor turned toward the voice, relief flooding through her. A young man in a clerk's vest stood a few feet away, his expression professionally neutral. "Yes," she said, managing a smile. "Yes, I'm Eleanor Hayes. Mr. Garrett sent me to escort you to the store, ma'am, if you'll follow me." The relief curdled into something else. He didn't come himself? The clerk shifted his weight, glancing away. "No, ma'am. He thought it best I bring you round." Best. The word hung in the air between them, ominous in its vagueness. But Eleanor lifted her chin and followed him down the platform steps, her bag heavy in her hand. Perhaps Thomas Garrett was simply busy with the store. Perhaps he was nervous. Perhaps he was a practical man who didn't see the need for romantic gestures when a proxy would do. Perhaps. The main street of Ash Creek was wider than it had appeared from the platform, lined with the usual frontier establishments. A land office, a bank that looked more like a reinforced shed, Two saloons already doing business despite the early hour, a hotel with a painted sign that proclaimed it the Excelsior House, and at the end of the block, a two-story building with large windows displaying dry goods and hardware. "That's Garrett's Mercantile," the clerk said, and Eleanor detected something in his tone she couldn't quite name. Pity, perhaps, or warning. They crossed the street, dodging a freight wagon loaded with lumber, and Eleanor became aware of eyes following their progress. Two women in calico dresses stopped their conversation to watch. A man sweeping the boardwalk paused mid-stroke. Even the dog sleeping in the shade of the general store lifted its head to observe them pass. Small towns, Eleanor reminded herself. Everyone notices everything. It doesn't mean anything. But her stomach tightened nonetheless. The Mercantile's door stood open to catch any stray breeze. Inside, the air smelled of wood shavings, coffee beans, and the particular mustiness of bolted fabric. The store was larger than Eleanor had expected, well-stocked and organized with the kind of precision that spoke of a meticulous owner. Shelves lined every wall, rising nearly to the ceiling. Barrels of flour and sugar crowded the center aisle. A glass case near the back displayed tobacco, penny candy, and writing supplies. And behind that case stood three people who turned as one when Eleanor entered. The first was a man who matched the description of Thomas Garrett, tall and dark-haired, his face unremarkable but not unpleasant, dressed in a town suit that had been brushed recently but showed wear at the cuffs. His expression was carefully blank. The second was a younger man, perhaps 20, with the same dark hair and a resemblance that suggested brotherhood. He looked uncomfortable, his gaze sliding away from Eleanor's as if he'd been caught witnessing something shameful. The third was a woman who could only be Thomas Garrett's mother. She stood ramrod straight despite her years, dressed in black bombazine that might have been fashionable 20 years ago back east. Her face was all hard angles, sharp nose, sharper cheekbones, eyes like flint. Her gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to lift her eyebrows into a permanent expression of disapproval. She held a piece of paper in one hand, and Eleanor recognized it immediately. The contract. Her contract. "Miss Hayes," Thomas Garrett said, and at least he had the grace to sound apologetic. "I apologize for the—" "Thomas, be quiet." The older woman's voice cut across her son's words like a blade. She stepped forward, the contract crackling in her grip, her eyes raking over Eleanor from head to toe with an assessment that felt like hands pawing through her clothes, measuring every inch of her worth and finding it wanting. Eleanor's spine straightened instinctively. "Mrs. Garrett, I presume?" "Indeed." The word dripped with contempt. "And you, I presume, are the woman who thought she could lie her way into my family." The air in the Mercantile seemed to thicken. Eleanor felt the clerk behind her take a step back, distancing himself from what was about to unfold. Through the open door, she could see people beginning to gather on the boardwalk outside, drawn by some sixth sense that told them a spectacle was brewing. "I don't understand," Eleanor said carefully, though the sick feeling in her stomach told her she understood perfectly. Mrs. Garrett smiled, a thin expression devoid of any warmth. "Don't you? Then let me enlighten you. My son placed an advertisement for a bride. A young bride, Miss Hayes. Someone who could bear him children and help build this family's future. The advertisement specified a woman under 25 years of age. You claimed in your letter to be 25 exactly. My son, trusting soul that he is, took you at your word." Eleanor's hands tightened on her bag. "Mrs. Garrett, but I," the older woman continued, her voice rising now, pitched to carry beyond the walls of the store to the growing crowd outside. "I am not so easily deceived. I wrote to the rooming house you listed as your previous address. The landlady there was most helpful. She remembered you well, remembered that you'd lived there for 3 years since you were 25, which makes you, by my calculation, 28 years old. Nearly 30. Well past the age when a woman can reliably bear healthy children, and certainly past the age my son specified in his advertisement." The words fell like blows. Eleanor felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced herself to meet Mrs. Garrett's eyes. "I'm 28, yes, but I'm in perfect health, and women have children well into their 30s. "Women lie when they're desperate," Mrs. Garrett said flatly. "You lied to secure a husband and a home. You misrepresented yourself fraudulently.
This contract, she held up the paper, is based on false pretenses and is therefore null and void. Mother, perhaps we could discuss this more privately, Thomas Garrett said weakly, but his mother silenced him with a single look. There's nothing to discuss, Thomas.
You told me you wanted to handle this yourself, to at least let the woman down gently. But I warned you that softness would only encourage her to plead and scheme. No. This ends here, publicly, so there can be no question of what transpired. Eleanor's vision blurred at the edges. The crowd outside had grown larger. She could see them pressing against the doorway, faces eager for tragedy, the way people always are when it's happening to someone else. She recognized the hunger in their expressions, the same hunger she'd seen on the faces of her aunt's former customers when the creditors had come, when Eleanor had been forced to sell the last of the shop's inventory on the street for pennies on the dollar. People loved watching someone fall. Mrs. Garrett, Eleanor tried again, hating the way her voice shook. I apologize for the deception. It was wrong, but I came here in good faith. I traveled 6 days alone with everything I own in this bag, and you what? The older woman took a step closer, her eyes glittering. You expected us to simply accept you? To overlook your dishonesty because you went to the trouble of getting on a train? That's not how the world works, Miss Hayes. Actions have consequences. Lies have consequences. She held up the contract between them, and for a moment Eleanor thought she might thrust it at her, force her to take it back. Instead, Mrs. Garrett smiled again, that terrible, thin smile, and tore the paper in half. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. No, Eleanor whispered. Mrs. Garrett tore it again, and again. She let the pieces fall from her hands to scatter across the mercantile floor like snow, like the last remnants of Eleanor's carefully constructed hope. That is what I think of your contract, Miss Hayes. That is what I think of liars who try to infiltrate decent families through fraud and deception. You are not welcome in my son's home. You are not welcome in this town. And if you have any dignity left at all, you'll be on tomorrow's train back to whatever pit of desperation you crawled out of. Eleanor stared at the scattered paper. She should bend down and pick up the pieces, she thought distantly. She should gather them up, try to prove the contract had existed, that she'd had every right to be here. But her legs wouldn't move. Her whole body felt frozen, locked in place while the crowd outside pressed closer, their faces a blur of judgment and satisfaction. Thomas? She turned to the man who was supposed to be her husband, searching his face for any sign of protest, any hint of the person who'd written those careful, not unkind letters. He wouldn't meet her eyes. I'm sorry, he mumbled. But Mother's right. You shouldn't have lied. His brother shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The clerk had disappeared entirely, and Mrs. Garrett stood triumphant, her mission accomplished, her family protected from the contamination of a desperate older woman with nothing to offer but good intentions and a willingness to work. Get out, Mrs. Garrett said softly. Get out of my son's store. Eleanor picked up her bag. Her hands moved automatically, her body following the command, even as her mind struggled to catch up with what had just happened. She turned toward the door, toward the crowd that now parted for her like she carried plague, their faces a mixture of curiosity, pity, and barely concealed glee. She walked through them, down the steps, into the street. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Garrett's voice carrying through the open door. Let that be a lesson to anyone else who thinks they can come to Ash Creek and make fools of honest people. We don't tolerate that kind of deception here. We have standards. The crowd began to disperse, already turning Eleanor's humiliation into a story they'd tell over dinner, embellishing it with each retelling until she became a cautionary tale, a warning to young girls about the dangers of desperation and the folly of trying to escape your circumstances through lies. Eleanor walked without direction, her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to let them see her cry. The main street stretched before her like a sentence. At the far end she could see the train tracks, the depot, the route back to everything she'd tried to escape. But tomorrow's train might as well have been a year away. She had barely enough money left for a week's worth of meals, let alone a ticket back east. And even if she did, back to what? To whom? There was nothing waiting for her in Philadelphia but the same closed doors and pitying glances, only now with failure added to her list of shortcomings. She found herself at the edge of town without meaning to, where the buildings gave way to scattered houses and eventually to open land. A wooden bench sat beneath a cottonwood tree, placed there perhaps for travelers to rest while waiting for the stage. Eleanor sank onto it, her bag at her feet, and finally let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. She'd been so careful, so methodical. She'd planned every detail of her escape, saved every penny, rehearsed every word she'd say when she finally met Thomas Garrett. She'd imagined 100 different versions of her arrival, some awkward, some sweet, some simply practical, but never this. Never this public dismantling, this calculated cruelty designed not just to reject her, but to ensure she understood exactly how unwelcome she was. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. It would be dark in a few hours. She needed to find somewhere to sleep, somewhere to think, somewhere to figure out what came next when you'd gambled everything and lost. Eleanor opened her bag and took inventory with shaking hands. 3 dresses, including the one she wore, 2 sets of undergarments, 1 nightgown, 1 pair of spare shoes that pinched, a hairbrush missing several teeth, a small sewing kit, a Bible her aunt had given her that Eleanor rarely opened, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, the sum total of her remaining funds. She counted it twice. $7.35. $7.35 between her and absolute destitution. She sat there as the light faded, watching the town of Ash Creek settle into its evening rhythms. Lamps flickered to life in windows. The saloons grew louder. Somewhere a baby cried, and a woman's voice sang a lullaby that drifted through the cooling air. Normal sounds, life continuing for everyone except her. You planning to sleep out here? Eleanor's head snapped up. A man stood a few feet away, silhouetted against the dying light. Her first instinct was fear. A woman alone at dusk in an unfamiliar place had every reason to be afraid. But something in his stance, the careful distance he maintained, the genuine question in his voice rather than threat, made her pause. "I don't know," she admitted. He stepped closer, and she could see him better now. He was tall, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they'd worked hard for every callus. His clothes were clean but worn, canvas trousers, a cotton shirt rolled to the elbows, boots that had seen 1,000 miles. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent their lives under the western sun, lined at the corners of his eyes and mouth, his jaw shadowed with a few days' growth of beard. He might have been 35 or 45. It was hard to tell with men shaped by wind and work. But his eyes, when they met hers, were a clear gray blue, and they held something she hadn't seen in any face today. Simple human decency. "You're the woman from the train," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor braced herself for judgment, for another recitation of her sins. "Yes." "Heard what happened at the Mercantile?" "Of course you did." She couldn't quite keep the bitterness from her voice. "I imagine everyone in Ash Creek heard by now." To her surprise, he nodded. "News travels fast in small towns, usually gets meaner with each telling." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Constance Garrett has a talent for making sure everyone hears her version of events first and loudest." Constance. So that was the old woman's name. Eleanor filed it away in the part of her mind that collected the names of people who'd hurt her, though she doubted she'd ever forget this particular one. "She certainly made her feelings clear," Eleanor said. "She usually does." The man shifted his weight, and Eleanor noticed he held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, a gesture of respect or perhaps nervousness. "Look, I don't mean to intrude, but it's getting dark, and this isn't the best place for a lady to spend the night. The Excelsior House rents rooms by the week. Mrs. Chen, who runs it, is fair and doesn't gossip much." "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. I'll consider it." He nodded and turned to go, and Eleanor watched him take 3 steps before her mouth moved faster than her pride. "Wait." He stopped. "I'm sorry, but I don't know your name." He turned back, a faint smile crossing his weathered face. Caleb Mercer." "Mr. Mercer." Eleanor stood, brushing dust from her skirts in an automatic gesture. "I appreciate your concern. Truly. But I should be honest, I have very little money, certainly not enough for a week's lodging and a train ticket back east. So I'm not sure what I'll do exactly, but I wanted you to know I'm not looking for charity." "Didn't think you were," Caleb said. "You don't have the look of someone who asks for handouts." "What do I have the look of?" The question came out sharper than she intended, all the day's humiliation suddenly rising in her throat like bile. But Caleb Mercer didn't flinch. He studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the strange sensation of being truly seen for the first time since she'd arrived in Ash Creek. Not assessed for her marriageability, or judged for her age, or measured against someone else's expectations, but simply observed as a person in a difficult situation. "Someone trying to survive," he said finally. "Someone who made a choice that didn't work out. Someone who probably won't break as easy as Constance Garrett thinks." The kindness in those words nearly undid her. Eleanor felt her throat tighten, tears threatening for the first time since she'd left the mercantile. She blinked them back fiercely. "I should let you get on," Caleb said, his voice gentler now. "But if you find yourself still in Ash Creek come morning, and you're of a mind to work rather than wait, you might come by the ranch supply store on 2nd Street and ask for me. I'm usually there early picking up feed." "Work?" Eleanor's voice cracked on the word. "My housekeeper quit 2 months back to get married. House has been going to hell ever since. If you can cook, clean, and don't mind isolation, it's honest work. Room, board, and fair wages. Nothing more, nothing less." He settled his hat back on his head and touched the brim in farewell. "Think about it. No shame either way." Then he walked away, his boots crunching on the dirt road, and disappeared into the gathering darkness. Eleanor stood frozen beneath the cottonwood tree, her mind racing. It could be a trap. Men made offers like that to desperate women, offers that started with housekeeping and ended in ways that destroyed what little reputation a woman had left. She'd heard the stories. Every woman had. But something in Caleb Mercer's voice, in the careful way he'd kept his distance, in the matter-of-fact delivery of his offer, nothing more, nothing less, made her think he might actually mean what he'd said. And what choice did she have, really? $7.35 wouldn't last long enough for pride to matter. Eleanor picked up her bag and walked back toward the main street, toward the Excelsior House with its painted sign. Tomorrow she would decide. Tonight, she would spend 50 cents on a room with a door that locked, and she would sleep in a real bed for what might be the last time in a while. Tomorrow, she would decide if desperation had finally pushed her into foolishness, or if Caleb Mercer's offer was exactly what he'd claimed, a chance to survive through honest work. Tomorrow, she would take the first step toward becoming something other than the woman who'd been rejected on a train platform. Tomorrow, Eleanor Hayes would stop being a cautionary tale and start being whoever came next. But tonight, walking through the darkening streets of Ash Creek with her carpet bag heavy in her hand and the eyes of the town still on her, all she could do was put one foot in front of the other and hold her head high. They'd tried to break her today. They hadn't succeeded. And that, Eleanor thought as she pushed open the door of the Excelsior House, would have to be enough. The room at the Excelsior House was smaller than a closet back east, but it was clean. Eleanor locked the door behind her, tested the latch twice to be certain, and finally allowed herself to collapse onto the narrow bed. The mattress was thin, the pillow flat, but after 6 days on a train and the worst day of her life, it felt like mercy. She didn't cry. She'd promised herself she wouldn't give Constance Garrett that satisfaction, even in private. Instead, she lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Ash Creek settling into night. Boots on the boardwalk below, laughter from the saloon down the street, a piano playing something mournful and out of tune. Somewhere in this town, Thomas Garrett was probably sitting down to dinner with his mother, relieved that she'd handled the unpleasant business of disposing of an inconvenient woman. Somewhere, people were telling the story of the desperate old maid who'd tried to lie her way into respectability. Let them talk, Eleanor thought. Let them make her into whatever story they needed. She'd be gone soon enough. The question was where. She turned onto her side, watching moonlight paint silver rectangles on the bare wall. Caleb Mercer's offer circled through her mind like a bird that wouldn't land. Housekeeping on a remote ranch, room, board, and wages. Nothing more, nothing less. It sounded too simple, which meant it probably wasn't. Men didn't offer women jobs out of pure charity, not in Eleanor's experience. There was always something else, some expectation unspoken but understood. But then again, what did she have that anyone would want? She was 28, plain-faced, with no connections and a reputation that had been shredded before it even began. If Caleb Mercer had dishonorable intentions, he could surely find easier prey than a woman the whole town now knew was desperate and alone. Eleanor sat up, fumbling for matches in the darkness. She lit the stub of candle on the bedside table and pulled out her small Bible, opening it to where her aunt had pressed a dried violet years ago. The flower crumbled at her touch, petals turning to dust between her fingers. Nothing lasted, she thought. Beauty faded. Promises broke. Even pressed flowers eventually returned to nothing. She closed the Bible and blew out the candle. Tomorrow she would go to the ranch supply store on 2nd Street. She would listen to what Caleb Mercer really wanted, and if it was honest work, truly honest, she would take it. Not because she trusted him, she didn't trust anyone anymore, but because survival required choices, and this was the only one being offered. Sleep came in fragments, punctuated by dreams of trains leaving without her, and contracts tearing endlessly in Constance Garrett's hands. Morning arrived too bright and too early. Eleanor washed in the basin of cold water, dressed in her second-best dress, a gray cotton that wouldn't show dirt, and pinned her hair with hands that had finally stopped shaking. In the small mirror above the washstand, her reflection looked older than 28. The journey and the humiliation had carved new lines around her eyes, new shadows beneath them. But her gaze was steady. That was something. Downstairs, the dining room smelled of coffee and fried potatoes. A handful of guests sat at the long table, 2 men in dusty trail clothes who didn't look up from their plates, and a severe woman in widow's weeds who watched Eleanor enter with undisguised curiosity. Mrs. Chen, the proprietress, appeared from the kitchen carrying a pot of coffee. She was a small woman with shrewd eyes and gray streaking her black hair, her accent marking her as one of the Chinese immigrants who'd come with the railroad and stayed when the work dried up. "You eat?" she asked Eleanor, her English blunt but clear. "Just coffee, please. I can't afford—" Mrs. Chen made a dismissive sound and returned with coffee and a plate of food anyway. "You pay for room, you eat. House rule." Eleanor wanted to argue, but her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl. She ate quickly, aware of the widow woman's stares, aware of the whispers that would start the moment she left. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly what she needed. "Thank you," she told Mrs. Chen, leaving 2 coins on the table. "I'll need the room one more night, if it's available." "Available," Mrs. Chen said, pocketing the coins. Then, lower. "You need work. You talk to me first. I know people. Safer than some offers." Eleanor met the older woman's eyes and saw understanding there, and warning. Mrs. Chen had survived in a frontier town as a foreign woman running a business. She knew exactly how many dangers waited for someone in Eleanor's position. "I'll remember that," Eleanor said. "Thank you." The morning sun was already hot when Eleanor stepped outside, the street busy with wagons and riders heading toward the various ranches and claims that surrounded Ash Creek. She asked a boy sweeping the boardwalk where to find 2nd Street, and he pointed wordlessly toward the east end of town, his eyes wide with recognition. Even the children knew her story now. The ranch supply store was a long building with corrals out back where horses stood hip-shot in the shade. Inside, it smelled of leather and hay and horse sweat, familiar smells that reminded Eleanor of her childhood before the city, before her aunt, before everything had narrowed to survival. A clerk was measuring out lengths of rope for a customer, and in the corner, examining a bridle with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for, stood Caleb Mercer. He looked up when Eleanor entered, and something in his face shifted, not quite surprise, but a careful neutrality that suggested he'd expected her and was now trying not to show relief or concern or whatever he actually felt. "Miss Hayes," he said, setting down the bridle, "you came." "I said I'd think about it." Eleanor kept her voice steady. "I'd like to hear more about this position." "Fair enough." Caleb glanced at the clerk, who was very obviously pretending not to listen. "There's a cafe across the street. We could talk there." The cafe was nearly empty, just an old man nursing coffee in the corner and a tired-looking waitress who brought them 2 cups without being asked. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, grateful for something to hold. "Here's the truth," Caleb said without preamble. "I run a cattle ranch about 2 hours north of here. Small operation, just me and 2 hands who live in the bunkhouse. Had a woman named Mrs. Kowalski keeping house for the past 5 years. Cooking, cleaning, mending, all the things I'm no good at. She got married in July and moved to her husband's place in Helena. I've been making do since then, but the house is a disaster, and the hands are threatening mutiny over my cooking." Eleanor listened, watching his face. He met her eyes directly when he spoke, no shifting or hedging. "I need someone who can manage a household," he continued. 3 meals a day for anywhere from 3 to 5 men depending on season. Cleaning, laundry, basic mending. The house isn't fancy, but it's solid. 3 bedrooms upstairs, kitchen and parlor down. You'd have your own room with a lock on the door. He emphasized those last words deliberately. $20 a month plus room and board. You'd take meals with us, but your time after dinner is your own. Sundays off unless there's an emergency. $20 a month. Eleanor's aunt had paid her 8. The boarding house where she'd spent her last year in Philadelphia had cost 6 a month for a room the size of a pantry. "Why me?" she asked. "You don't know anything about me except that I'm desperate, and the whole town thinks I'm a liar." Caleb took a sip of his coffee, considering. "I know you traveled 1,000 miles alone to try to build something better. I know you didn't make a scene yesterday even though you had every right to. I know Constance Garrett went out of her way to humiliate you in front of half the town, which tells me she saw you as a threat." "A threat?" Eleanor almost laughed. "To what?" "To her control." Caleb set down his cup. "Constance runs this town like it's her personal kingdom. Her husband was mayor for 20 years before he died. Her oldest son runs the mercantile. Her youngest is being groomed for territorial legislature. She decides who's respectable and who isn't, who gets credit at the stores and who doesn't, whose daughters are suitable for whose sons. A woman coming in from outside, not already sorted into her system, that's dangerous to someone like her." Eleanor thought about the way Constance had smiled when she tore up the contract, the satisfaction in her voice when she'd ordered Eleanor to leave. It hadn't just been about protecting her son. It had been about power. "But that still doesn't explain why you're offering me work," Eleanor said. "For all you know, I could be exactly what she said, a liar and a fraud." "Could be," Caleb agreed. "Or you could be a woman who adjusted her age by 3 years because she knew no one would give her a chance otherwise." "I've stretched the truth in my time too, Miss Hayes. Most people have, when the alternative was worse." The waitress refilled their cups, her presence buying Eleanor a moment to think. This could still be a mistake. He could still be something other than what he appeared, but Mrs. Chen's words echoed in her mind, safer than some offers. And Eleanor realized that the old woman's warning hadn't been about Caleb Mercer specifically. It had been about the world in general, and the fact that even dangerous choices were still choices. "If I agree," Eleanor said slowly, "and it doesn't work out, if you're not satisfied with my work, or if I find the situation isn't what you've described, what then? Then I pay you for the time worked and drive you back to town. No questions asked. I'm not looking to trap anyone, Miss Hayes. I'm looking for help running a ranch." Eleanor studied his weathered face, the gray-blue eyes that held hers without wavering. She thought about her $7.35. She thought about Mrs. Chen's kindness and the widow woman's stares and the way Thomas Garrett hadn't even had the courage to reject her himself. She thought about going back east with nothing, or staying in Ash Creek where everyone knew her as the desperate woman who'd lied about her age. "I can cook," she said. "Not fancy, but substantial. I can clean and mend. I'm not afraid of hard work. That's all I'm asking for." "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Mercer. When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll pick you up at the Excelsior House at dawn. Bring whatever you have. The ranch isn't close to town, so you won't be coming back often." They shook hands across the table, his grip firm and brief, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, she'd learned better than that, but possibility. A door opening when she'd thought they were all closed. She spent the rest of the day preparing. She washed her clothes in the basin in her room and hung them to dry by the window. She inventoried her sewing kit and found it adequate but not impressive. She counted her money again, $6.85 now, after 2 nights at the Excelsior House, and tucked it into the hidden pocket she'd sewn into her best dress. Mrs. Chen brought her an extra biscuit at dinner, and Eleanor thanked her and accepted the unspoken blessing in the gesture. That evening, as the sun painted the mountains gold and purple, Eleanor stood at her window watching Ash Creek settle into its rhythms. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of town, was a ranch where she'd be starting over. Again. The thought should have exhausted her, but instead she felt a strange calm. She'd survived yesterday's humiliation. She'd survived the night. She'd made a choice that might be wrong, but was at least hers to make. In the street below, she saw a familiar figure, Constance Garrett, walking with 2 other women, their heads bent together in conversation. Eleanor watched them pause outside the mercantile, watched Constance gesture emphatically while the other women nodded, spreading more poison probably, making sure everyone knew that the desperate woman was still in town, still a cautionary tale. Eleanor stepped back from the window. Let them talk. Tomorrow she'd be gone, and Ash Creek could find someone else to feed its appetite for scandal. She slept better that night and woke before dawn to find frost on the window. Autumn was coming, and with it the Montana winter everyone spoke of with mixture of respect and dread. Eleanor dressed in her warmest clothes, packed her bag, and carried it downstairs where Mrs. Chen was already up, starting the kitchen fire. "You go to Mercer Ranch?" Mrs. Chen asked. "Yes. How did you know?" The old woman smiled slightly. "Small town. People talk. Mercer is good man. Fair. You work hard. He treats you right. You know him?" "Everyone know Mercer. He come here 8 years ago, buy ranch from widow who couldn't manage alone. Pay fair price, hire her son as hand. That's the kind of man he is." Mrs. Chen pressed a cloth-wrapped bundle into Eleanor's hands. "Biscuits. For Journey." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Thank you. For everything. You need room again. You come back. Door always open for women who work hard." The sky was just beginning to lighten when Caleb Mercer's wagon pulled up outside. Eleanor climbed up beside him, her bag at her feet, and they rolled out of Ash Creek as the town began to wake. She didn't look back. The road north was rough, winding through grassland that stretched endlessly toward mountains whose peaks still held snow despite the season. They passed other ranches, most just clusters of buildings against the vast landscape, and Caleb pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a creek that ran year-round, the place where the road forked toward the mining camps in the hills. They didn't talk much. Eleanor was grateful for the silence, for the chance to watch the country change around her, to feel distance growing between herself and yesterday's shame. The air smelled different out here, cleaner, tinged with sage and grass and the particular crispness that came before true cold. "That's it," Caleb said finally, pointing ahead. The ranch sat in a shallow valley, sheltered on 3 sides by low hills. The house was 2 stories of weathered wood, solid and plain, with a porch that wrapped around the front. Beside it stood a barn, a bunkhouse, and several smaller outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. It wasn't pretty in any conventional sense, but it looked real and permanent, like it had earned its place in this landscape. 2 men emerged from the barn as the wagon approached. Ranch hands, Eleanor guessed, from their work-worn clothes and the way they moved with the easy confidence of men who knew their business. The younger one was perhaps 20, tall and rail-thin with red hair. The older was stocky and weathered, his face hidden partly by a full beard. "Miss Hayes," Caleb said, helping her down from the wagon. "This is Tommy Reed and Jack Bishop. They work the ranch with me. Boys, this is Miss Eleanor Hayes. She'll be keeping house for us." Tommy's eyes widened with recognition, but Jack just nodded gravely. "Ma'am," he said, "welcome to the Broken Creek Ranch." "Thank you," Eleanor said, holding his gaze. If he'd heard the stories from town, his face didn't show it, but Tommy couldn't help himself. "You're the lady from the train platform," he blurted out. "The one Mrs. Garrett—" "Tommy," Caleb's voice cut across the boy's words, not harsh but firm. "Miss Hayes is here to work, same as us. What happened in town stays in town. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Tommy said, his face reddening. "Sorry, ma'am." Eleanor lifted her chin. "It's all right. I imagine everyone within 50 miles knows the story by now. Yes, I was rejected as a mail-order bride. Yes, I lied about my age. Yes, Mrs. Garrett made sure the whole town witnessed my humiliation. But I'm here now, and I intend to do the job I was hired for. If that's a problem for anyone, speak now." The three men stared at her. Then Jack Bishop's weathered face creased into something that might have been approval. "No problem here, ma'am," he said. "Any woman who'd face down Constance Garrett and live to tell about it is all right in my book." "I didn't exactly face her down," Eleanor said dryly. "I stood there while she tore up my contract and told me to leave town." "You didn't cry," Tommy said suddenly. "My sister said you just stood there and didn't cry at all. She said it was the bravest thing she'd ever seen." Eleanor felt something crack in her chest. She'd thought no one in that crowd had seen anything but scandal and entertainment. She'd thought they'd all been like Constance Garrett, feeding on her shame. But apparently someone, Tommy's sister, whoever she was, had seen something else. "Your sister is kind," Eleanor managed, "but I should see the house now. I imagine it needs work." "That's putting it mildly," Caleb said, and led her inside. The house was indeed a disaster. Dishes were piled in the kitchen, some crusted with what might have been food from days ago. Dust covered every surface. Mud tracked across the floors. The parlor looked like no one had cleaned it in months, and when Eleanor climbed the stairs to see her room, she found it filled with boxes and broken furniture. "I'll clear this out today," Caleb said, looking embarrassed. "Mrs. Kowalski kept everything organized. After she left, things just got away from me." Eleanor surveyed the chaos with a strange sense of relief. This was concrete. This was fixable. You couldn't fix humiliation or repair a torn contract, but you could absolutely clean a house. "I'll need supplies," she said. "Soap, lye, vinegar if you have it, clean rags, a decent broom, and I'll need to see what you have for food. I'm guessing the pantry is as chaotic as everything else." "Probably worse," Caleb admitted. "Then we'd better get started." She spent the morning clearing her room, with Tommy's help. The boy was eager and clumsy, apologizing every time he bumped into something, but his cheerfulness was oddly comforting. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle they ran, about his family's small claim on the other side of Ash Creek, where his father and mother scratched out a living with more hope than profit. "I send money home when I can," he said, carrying a broken chair downstairs. "Mr. Mercer pays fair, better than most. Ma's real grateful." By afternoon, Eleanor's room was cleared and scrubbed. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses on pegs, and arranging her small items on the dresser. The room was plain, but it had a window that looked out toward the mountains, and when she tried the lock on the door, it worked smoothly. Privacy, security, simple things that felt like luxury. She tackled the kitchen next, heating water and washing the accumulated dishes while taking stock of supplies. The pantry was better than she'd feared. Flour, beans, salt pork, dried apples, canned vegetables, even a small store of precious coffee. Caleb might not know how to cook, but he'd at least stocked the essentials. That evening, she made the first meal. Nothing fancy, just biscuits and gravy with fried salt pork and boiled beans. But it was hot and substantial, and when she carried it out to the table where the three men waited, the looks on their faces made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Useful. "Ma'am," Jack said after his first bite, "this is the best meal we've had in 2 months." "It's just biscuits and gravy," Eleanor said. "It's perfect," Tommy declared through a full mouth, earning himself a look from Caleb. "Manners," Caleb said mildly, but he was smiling. To Eleanor he added, "Seriously, thank you. I didn't realize how much we'd been suffering until now." Eleanor sat down with her own plate, still uncomfortable eating with them, but understanding that this was part of the job. Ranch hands and housekeepers ate together. Formality didn't survive frontier practicality. "Tomorrow I'll start on the rest of the house," she said. "It'll take a few days to get everything in order, but it's manageable." "Take whatever time you need," Caleb said. "We're just grateful to have hot food and clean shirts." After dinner, Eleanor washed dishes while the men sat on the porch smoking and discussing the next day's work. Through the window she could hear their voices, low and comfortable, punctuated by Jack's occasional laugh. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and outside the window the mountains had turned purple in the twilight. Eleanor's hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of cleaning, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she felt something like peace. This wasn't the future she'd imagined. This wasn't marriage or respectability or any of the things she'd traveled west to find. But it was honest work and fair pay and a room with a lock on the door. It was enough. It had to be enough. The days fell into a rhythm. Eleanor rose before dawn to start the kitchen fire and make breakfast. After the men rode out to work the ranch, she cleaned, systematically working through each room, scrubbing years of bachelor neglect from floors and walls and windows. She washed clothes and hung them on the line behind the house, where they snapped like flags in the constant wind. She mended torn shirts and socks worn thin, her needle moving in the lamplight while the men played cards at the kitchen table. She learned their habits. Jack liked his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Tommy would eat anything but had a weakness for dried apple pie. Caleb was quiet in the mornings, more talkative in the evenings after the day's work was done. None of them questioned her presence or made her feel unwelcome. They treated her with the same practical respect they showed each other, and Eleanor found herself relaxing into the routine. But Ash Creek hadn't forgotten her. On her 5th day at the ranch, Caleb returned from town with supplies and news that made his jaw tight. "You should know," he said, finding Eleanor in the kitchen where she was kneading bread dough. "Constance Garrett is spreading stories about you." Eleanor's hand stilled. "What kind of stories?" "The kind that suggest you're here under improper circumstances. That I didn't really hire you as a housekeeper." Heat flooded Eleanor's face. She should have expected this, should have known that a woman like Constance Garrett wouldn't be satisfied with just one humiliation. "I see," she said quietly. "Do you want me to leave?" "What? No." Caleb looked genuinely startled. "Why would I want that?" "Because now I'm not just a liar, I'm also a woman of questionable morals, and having me here damages your reputation." "My reputation can handle it," Caleb said flatly. "The question is whether you can handle it, because once Constance starts talking, the whole town listens." Eleanor thought about the widow woman at the Excelsior house, about the boy who'd pointed silently when she asked for directions, about Tommy's sister who'd called her brave. She thought about the contract torn to pieces, about 6 days on a train for nothing, about every door that had closed in Philadelphia before she'd left. "I can handle it," she said, and went back to kneading dough. That night, lying in her room with moonlight painting silver across the floorboards, Eleanor listened to the wind howl around the house and made herself a promise. She wouldn't hide. She wouldn't slink away from town whenever Caleb needed to go for supplies. She wouldn't give Constance Garrett the satisfaction of seeing her cower. She'd come west to build a new life. That life might not look like she'd planned, but it was hers, earned through work and purchased with humiliation. And she'd be damned if she let anyone take it away. The test came sooner than expected. A week after Caleb's warning, he asked if she wanted to ride into Ash Creek with him for supplies. "You don't have to," he said. "I can bring back whatever you need." "I'll come," Eleanor said, and ignored the way her stomach clenched with nerves. The town looked exactly the same, dusty and determined, sprawling against the big sky. But everything felt different now. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon in front of the general store with her shopping list in hand and her head high, and walked inside like she had every right to be there. The store went quiet when she entered. 3 women who'd been examining fabric turned to stare. The clerk behind the counter, not the same one who'd escorted her from the train, thankfully, looked uncomfortable. Eleanor pulled out her list. "I need 5 pounds of flour, 2 of sugar, salt and baking powder. Also thread if you have it, white and black." Yes, ma'am," the clerk stammered, and began gathering her order. One of the women whispered something to her companions, and they giggled. Eleanor felt her face heat but kept her eyes on the clerk. Behind her, the door opened and she heard Caleb's boots on the wooden floor. He didn't say anything, just stood there, a quiet presence at her back. "That'll be $2.40, the clerk said. Eleanor counted out the money from her wages, her own money, earned through her own work. The coins rang on the counter like small victories. "Thank you," she said clearly, and turned to leave. "Excuse me." The voice came from one of the women, younger than Eleanor, perhaps 22 or 23, wearing a dress that suggested her family had money. Her face was alight with malicious curiosity. "Yes?" Eleanor said. "I just wanted to say, it's very brave of you to show your face in town. After everything that happened, most women would be too ashamed. The other women tittered. The clerk looked down at his ledger, and Eleanor felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. "Shame," she said slowly, "is what you feel when you've done something wrong. I came to Ash Creek in good faith, looking for an honest chance at a new life. If that makes me shameful, then I'll own it. But I wonder what word we'd use for someone who goes out of their way to humiliate a stranger for entertainment. Do you know, miss?" The young woman's smile faltered. "I didn't think so," Eleanor said. "Good day." She walked out with Caleb behind her, her packages in her arms and her heart hammering. Only when they were in the wagon, rolling out of town, did she let herself breathe. "You all right?" Caleb asked. "No," Eleanor admitted, "but I will be." He nodded, and they rode in silence for a while. Then, "You did good in there." "I wanted to hit her," Eleanor confessed. "I know, but you didn't. That's worth more." Maybe, Eleanor thought, or maybe standing up to petty cruelty with calm words was just another form of survival. Either way, she'd done it. She'd faced down the gossip and walked out standing. It wasn't victory exactly, but it wasn't defeat either, and for now, that would have to do. The confrontation in the general store should have been the end of it, but Eleanor was learning that Constance Garrett didn't know how to let things go. Over the following weeks, the rumors grew more vicious. Caleb heard them in town, whispers that Eleanor wasn't just a housekeeper, but something far less respectable, that she'd seduced him into giving her work, that the whole arrangement was a scandal waiting to explode. The other ranchers' wives, most of whom took their social cues from Constance, began to treat Caleb with a coolness that bordered on contempt. "Mrs. Patterson crossed the street to avoid speaking to me yesterday," Caleb told Eleanor one evening as she served dinner. His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "And Frank Morrison made some comment about me keeping company that wasn't exactly friendly." Eleanor set down the platter of roast chicken with more force than necessary. "I should leave. This is exactly what I was afraid of. My presence is hurting you." "You're not going anywhere," Jack said gruffly, helping himself to potatoes. "Let them talk. We know the truth." "The truth doesn't matter if no one believes it," Eleanor said. "In a town like Ash Creek, perception is reality. And right now, everyone perceives me as a fallen woman corrupting a decent man." Tommy looked miserable. "My ma asked me about it last Sunday. She wanted to know if there was anything improper going on. I told her no, that you keep to yourself and work hard, but I could tell she didn't quite believe me." "Even your mother thinks I'm a harlot," Eleanor said flatly. "That's wonderful." "She doesn't think that," Tommy protested. "She's just worried about what people are saying. Ma cares a lot about what people think." "Most people do," Caleb said quietly. "That's what gives someone like Constance Garrett her power. She controls the narrative and everyone else falls in line because they're afraid of being the next target." Eleanor pushed food around her plate, her appetite gone. She'd thought standing up to the gossip would be enough, that showing her face in town with dignity would eventually win people over. But she'd underestimated Constance's determination and the town's willingness to believe the worst. "There's a town meeting next week," Caleb continued, his voice careful. "Constance has been pushing for it. She's convinced the council that we need to discuss moral standards in the community." Eleanor's fork clattered to her plate. "She's calling a meeting about me?" "Not specifically, but everyone knows that's what it's really about. She'll make it sound like she's concerned about the town's reputation, about protecting families and upholding decency, and then she'll find a way to make an example of you." "An example how?" Eleanor felt her chest tighten with familiar panic. What can she actually do? "In a town like this?" Jack shook his head grimly. "Plenty. She can pressure the merchants not to serve you. She can make sure no one will hire you if you try to find other work. She can turn you into such a pariah that you'll have no choice but to leave." "She can't force Eleanor to do anything," Tommy said, but he sounded uncertain. "She doesn't have to use force," Caleb said. "She just has to make staying here unbearable." Eleanor stood abruptly, carrying her plate to the kitchen, though she'd barely touched the food. Through the window, she could see the sun setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that should have been beautiful, but just looked like fire. She'd survived being publicly rejected. She'd survived starting over with nothing. But she didn't know if she could survive being systematically destroyed by a woman who saw her as a threat to some imagined social order. Behind her, she heard Caleb dismiss the other men. Boots scraped on the floor, the door opened and closed, and then it was just the two of them in the kitchen with the lamps casting long shadows. "I won't let her run you off," Caleb said. Eleanor turned to face him. He stood in the doorway, his weathered face serious, his gray-blue eyes steady on hers. "You can't stop her," Eleanor said. "You've already done more for me than anyone had a right to expect. But this is my problem, not yours." "That's where you're wrong." Caleb stepped into the kitchen, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "When I hired you, I made it my problem. When I brought you to this ranch, I took responsibility for your safety and your reputation. And I'll be damned if I'm going to stand by while Constance Garrett destroys a good woman just to prove she can." "I'm not a good woman," Eleanor said bitterly. "I lied about my age. I came west under false pretenses. Everything she says about me is essentially true." "Everything she says about you is essentially cruel," Caleb corrected. "There's a difference between truth and cruelty, Eleanor. You adjusted your age by 3 years because you were desperate. That doesn't make you a liar any more than every other person who's ever stretched the truth to survive. It makes you human." It was the first time he'd called her by her first name. The intimacy of it startled them both. Eleanor saw Caleb's jaw tighten, saw him recognize the boundary he'd just crossed, but he didn't apologize or take it back. "I have an idea," he said instead, "but you're not going to like it." "I don't like anything about this situation. What's your idea?" Caleb hesitated, and Eleanor saw something like nervousness cross his weathered face. "We could get married. Actually married. At dawn before the town meeting, so when Constance makes her accusations, we can present the marriage certificate and shut down the whole thing." The words hung into the air between them, like something physical. Eleanor stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You want to marry me? To spite Constance Garrett?" "Not to spite anyone," Caleb said. "To protect you. To give you the respectability she's trying to take away. To make it impossible for her to claim anything improper is happening here." "That's insane," Eleanor said. "You can't just marry someone to win an argument." "Why not? People marry for worse reasons. Hell, you were willing to marry Thomas Garrett sight unseen. At least you know me. You know I'm offering you exactly what I say I'm offering. Protection, respectability, and nothing more unless you wanted it to be more, which I'm not presuming you do." Eleanor sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, her mind racing. He was right that she'd been willing to marry a stranger, but that had been different. That had been a business arrangement, clearly defined by contract and expectation. What was this? "You'd be married to me," she said slowly. "Actually, legally married, for the rest of your life, or until one of us died. That's not a small thing, Caleb." "I know." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I've thought about it, more than you might think. I'm 37 years old. I've been running this ranch alone for 8 years, and before that I was working other people's land, saving every penny to buy my own place. I never had time for courting or romance or any of the things that usually lead to marriage. And honestly, I never much minded. I like my life. I like the work and the land and the quiet. Then why complicate it with a wife you don't want?" "I didn't say I didn't want a wife." Caleb's voice was patient. "I said I never had time to find one. But you're here now. You're a good woman, Eleanor, no matter what you think about yourself. You work hard. You don't complain. You stand up to bullies with more courage than most men I know. And you deserve better than what this town is trying to do to you." Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "You barely know me." "I know enough, and we'd have time to learn the rest." "What if we can't stand each other a year from now?" "Then we'll be in the same position as half the married couples in Montana Territory," Caleb said with a slight smile. "We'll work it out, or we won't. But at least you won't be at the mercy of Constance Garrett's gossip." Eleanor pressed her hands to her face, trying to organize her scattered thoughts. This was madness. This was the most impulsive, reckless thing she'd ever considered, and she'd already traveled 1,000 miles on the word of a stranger. But the alternative was letting Constance win, letting herself be driven out of yet another place with nothing but shame and a carpetbag. "I wouldn't be a real wife," she said through her fingers. Not in all the ways wives are supposed to be. I understand that. I'd still want my own room, my own space. Of course. And I'd need time to figure out if this could be more than just a legal arrangement. I won't be rushed into anything. Eleanor, Caleb's voice was gentle. I'm offering you a choice, not making demands. We can make this marriage whatever we want it to be. The only thing that matters right now is protecting you from Constance's campaign. Eleanor lowered her hands and looked at him across the scarred kitchen table. His face was open, honest, without any of the calculation or hidden agenda she'd learned to watch for in men. He meant what he said. He would marry her for no other reason than because it was the right thing to do, and he would expect nothing from her except what she was willing to give. It was possibly the kindest offer anyone had ever made her. All right, she heard herself say. Yes, we'll get married. Caleb exhaled, and Eleanor realized he'd been holding his breath. Tomorrow morning, then, before the town meeting. There's a circuit judge staying at the hotel in Ash Creek. I saw his notice posted last week. We can have him perform the ceremony, get the certificate, and then go straight to the meeting with proof that everything is legitimate and legal. What about Jack and Tommy? They'll need to know. I'll tell them tonight. They'll be witnesses if we need them. Eleanor nodded, feeling detached from her own body, like she was watching someone else agree to marry a man she'd known for 3 weeks. I should go to bed then. Tomorrow will be eventful. She stood, but Caleb caught her hand before she could leave. His grip was warm and calloused, rough from years of ranch work, but somehow gentle too. Thank you, he said quietly. I know this isn't what you wanted, but I'll do my best to make sure you don't regret it. You're saving me from public humiliation, Eleanor said. Again, I think I should be thanking you. She left him sitting at the kitchen table and climbed the stairs to her room, where she locked the door and sat on the bed in the darkness, trying to comprehend what she'd just agreed to. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Caleb Mercer. Tomorrow she would walk into that town meeting as a married woman with all the respectability that status conveyed. Tomorrow she would finally have what she'd come west to find. A new name, a new life, a new identity. Just not in any way she could have imagined. She didn't sleep much. When dawn came, pale and cold, she dressed in her best dress, the blue one with ivory buttons that she'd worn on the train platform a lifetime ago. She pinned up her hair with shaking hands and stared at her reflection in the small mirror. Today she would get married. Today she would become someone's wife. The thought was surreal. Caleb was waiting by the wagon, dressed in a dark suit that made him look unfamiliar and oddly formal. Jack and Tommy stood beside him, both cleaned up and serious-faced. You look beautiful, Tommy blurted out, then immediately turned red. Thank you, Eleanor said, touched by his earnestness. You all look very handsome. They rode to Ash Creek in silence, arriving just as the town began to stir. The hotel was a modest 2-story building, and the circuit judge's office was a converted storeroom on the first floor. Judge Blackwell was a lean man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers who looked at them with sharp curiosity when Caleb explained what they wanted. Marriage license and ceremony this early in the morning? The judge's eyebrows rose. Is there some urgency? Yes, Caleb said simply. We'd like to be married before the town meeting this afternoon. I see. The judge studied them both, his gaze lingering on Eleanor. And you, Miss, Hayes, Eleanor said. Eleanor Hayes. And yes, I want this. I'm here of my own free will. You understand that marriage is a legally binding contract, that it cannot be easily dissolved? I understand. The judge looked at Caleb. And you, Mr. Mercer? You're certain about this? I am. Something in their voices must have convinced him, because Judge Blackwell nodded and pulled out the necessary papers. He explained the legal requirements, had them sign the license, and then asked them to stand before him with Jack and Tommy as witnesses. Join hands, the judge instructed. Eleanor's hand felt small in Caleb's rough palm. She could feel her pulse hammering, could see the morning light slanting through the dusty window, could hear the sounds of Ash Creek waking up outside. This was real. This was actually happening. Do you, Caleb Mercer, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do,
Caleb's voice was steady. "And do you, Eleanor Hayes, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Eleanor looked up at Caleb's weathered face, at the gray blue eyes that had shown her nothing but kindness, at the man who was offering her protection when he had no obligation to do so. "I do," she said. "Then, by the authority vested in me by Montana Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride if you wish." Caleb leaned down and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to Eleanor's forehead. It was over in a second, but Eleanor felt the warmth of it settle in her chest like an ember. "Congratulations," Judge Blackwell said, handing them the marriage certificate. "May you find happiness together." They walked out into the morning sun as husband and wife. Eleanor kept expecting to feel different, transformed somehow, but she just felt like herself, nervous and determined, and more than a little terrified of what was coming next. "The meeting isn't until 2 o'clock, Caleb said. "We have time for breakfast if you want." They ate at the small cafe, though Eleanor could barely taste the food. Word of their marriage was already spreading. She could see it in the way people stared through the cafe window, in the whispered conversations that started and stopped as they passed. By noon, the whole town would know. By afternoon, Constance Garrett would know. "She's going to be furious," Sean Tommy said, voicing what they were all thinking. "Let her be furious," Jack said grimly. "She can't touch you now, Eleanor. You're a married woman, respectable as they come." But Eleanor wasn't so sure. Constance Garrett had proven herself capable of remarkable cruelty. A marriage certificate might protect Eleanor legally, but it wouldn't stop the whispers or the judgment. It would just change the shape of them. At 2 o'clock, they walked to the town hall, a large single room that served for meetings, dances, and occasional church services. It was already crowded. Eleanor recognized faces from the train platform, from the general store, from her brief glimpse of Ash Creek society. Women in their best dresses, men in Sunday suits, all gathered to hear what Constance Garrett had to say about moral standards. Constance herself stood at the front of the room with the town council, her black dress making her look like a crow perched among pigeons. Her eyes found Eleanor immediately, and something like triumph flashed across her sharp features. She'd been expecting Eleanor to hide, to stay away, to prove through absence that she was ashamed. Eleanor lifted her chin and walked down the center aisle with Caleb at her side, Jack and Tommy following behind. They took seats in the third row, and Eleanor felt every eye in the room tracking their progress. The mayor, a soft-bellied man named Henderson, called the meeting to order. There were routine announcements, repairs needed on the schoolhouse, discussion of a new well for the north side of town. Then Henderson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Garrett has requested time to address the council regarding community standards." "Mrs. Garrett?" Constance stood with the same sharp smile Eleanor remembered from the Mercantile. She looked out over the crowd, letting the silence build, commanding attention with the ease of someone who'd never doubted her own authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and carrying, "I come before you today with a heavy heart. Our town has always prided itself on its moral character, on being a place where decent families can build decent lives. But recently, I've become aware of a situation that threatens to undermine everything we've worked to create here." Eleanor felt Caleb's hand find hers under cover of the bench. She held on tight. "We have in our midst," Constance continued, "a woman who came to Ash Creek under false pretenses, who lied about her age to secure a marriage contract, who, when exposed for her deception, did not leave town as any decent woman would, but instead found employment with a bachelor rancher, living in his home, alone with him and his men, no chaperone, no oversight, no regard for propriety or reputation." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eleanor saw women nodding, saw men looking uncomfortable, saw the machinery of social judgment grinding into motion. "Now, I don't presume to know what goes on at the Broken Creek Ranch," Constance said with false delicacy. "I'm sure Mr. Mercer is a gentleman, but appearances matter, ladies and gentlemen. And the appearance of this situation is deeply troubling. Young women in this town look to us for guidance about proper behavior. What message does it send when we allow someone like Miss Hayes to—" "Mrs. Mercer," Eleanor heard her own voice cutting across Constance's speech before she'd consciously decided to speak. Every head in the room swiveled toward her. She stood,
her legs somehow steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying clear and strong. "But you're using the wrong name. It's Mrs. Mercer now, as of this morning." The room exploded into shocked whispers. Constance's face went rigid with fury. Mayor Henderson looked confused. "What are you saying?" Constance demanded. Caleb stood beside Eleanor. "She's saying we got married this morning, Mrs. Garrett, at dawn, with Judge Blackwell officiating. So your concerns about propriety are noted but unnecessary. My wife lives in my home as my wife. There's nothing improper about it." "Your wife?" Constance's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You married her? After everything you did to humiliate her? Yes." Caleb's voice was calm but carried an edge of steel. "After you made sure the whole town witnessed her rejection, after you tore up her contract and told her to leave. After all of that, I hired her as my housekeeper. And over the past few weeks, I've come to know her as a good, decent, hardworking woman who deserves respect. So yes, Mrs. Garrett, I married her." Eleanor felt something break open in her chest. He was defending her. In front of the whole town, in front of Constance Garrett's fury, Caleb was standing up for her. "Show them the certificate," someone called from the back. Eleanor recognized Mrs. Chen's accented voice. Caleb pulled the marriage certificate from his pocket and held it up. "Judge Blackwell can verify it, if anyone doubts. We're legally married. That makes Eleanor a respectable married woman, which I believe was your concern, Mrs. Garrett?" Constance's face had gone white with rage. "This is a sham, a calculated move to what?" Eleanor heard herself saying. She stepped into the aisle, facing Constance across the crowded room. "To protect myself from your vendetta? Yes, absolutely. You made it clear from the moment I arrived that you intended to destroy me. You tore up my contract in front of the whole town. You spread vicious rumors about my character. You called this meeting specifically to publicly shame me one more time. So yes, Mrs. Garrett, I married Caleb Mercer to protect myself from you, and I'd do it again." The silence in the room was absolute. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of all those eyes on her, judging, measuring, deciding. Then Mrs. Chen stood up in the back. "I think Mrs. Mercer is very brave," she said clearly. "Woman comes here alone, gets treated terrible, still holds her head up. That's brave, not shameful." "She lied about her age," someone protested. 3 years, Mrs. Chen shot back. "Everyone here ever lied about anything? Ever stretched truth to get by? Then you got no right to judge." Eleanor saw movement in her peripheral vision. Tommy's mother, a tired-looking woman in a faded dress, stood up slowly. "My son works at the Broken Creek Ranch," she said quietly. "He tells me Mrs. Mercer, Eleanor, works harder than anyone he knows, treats everyone with respect, never complains. That sounds like good character to me." Another woman stood. Eleanor recognized her from the general store, one of the 3 who'd giggled at the clerk's wife's cruel comment, but now she looked ashamed. "I was there when you confronted Eleanor in the store," she said to her companions, "and I was there on the train platform when Mrs. Garrett humiliated her. I didn't say anything either time because I was scared of being next. But I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of pretending that cruelty is the same as moral standards." One by one, other women stood. Not all of them. Not even most. But enough. Enough to show that Constance Garrett's power over the town wasn't as absolute as she'd believed. "This is ridiculous," Constance said, her voice rising. "You're all being manipulated by a woman who survived," Eleanor said softly. "That's my crime, Mrs. Garrett. I survived your cruelty. I found work when you wanted me to starve. I found protection when you wanted me destroyed. I built a life when you wanted me broken, and now I'm standing in front of this whole town, legally married to a good man who saw my worth when you only saw a target. So yes, you're right to be angry, because I didn't disappear, and I won't." The room erupted in noise, some people applauding, others arguing, everyone talking at once. Mayor Henderson banged his gavel uselessly, trying to restore order. Constance stood frozen, her face a mask of fury and disbelief, as the meeting dissolved into chaos around her. Caleb took Eleanor's hand. "We should go." They walked out together, past the arguing crowds. Past Constance Garrett's stricken face, past the curious and the supportive and the scandalized. They walked out into the afternoon sun, and Eleanor felt like she could breathe for the first time in weeks. "You were magnificent," Caleb said quietly. "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted. "That's what made it magnificent." Tommy and Jack caught up with them at the wagon, both grinning. "Did you see Mrs. Garrett's face?" Tommy said gleefully. "I thought her head was going to explode." "Show some respect," Jack said, but he was smiling too. "That's Mrs. Mercer's mortal enemy you're laughing about." "Former enemy," Eleanor corrected. "I don't have enemies anymore. I just have a life." They rode back to the ranch as the sun began its descent, painting the grasslands gold. Eleanor sat beside Caleb, her husband, she reminded herself, still getting used to the word, and watched the landscape change around them. The Broken Creek Ranch appeared in the distance, solid and real, and Eleanor realized she was looking at it differently now. Not as a temporary refuge or a workplace, but as home. "Are you all right?" Caleb asked. Eleanor thought about the question. Was she all right? She'd been publicly humiliated, forced to take charity work, driven into a marriage of convenience to escape social destruction. She should be devastated. She should be broken. Instead, she felt something that might have been hope. "Yes," she said, "I think I actually am." That night, after dinner, and after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, Eleanor stood in her room, still her room, with its lock and its privacy, and looked at the simple gold band on her finger. Caleb had bought it quickly that morning, a plain circle of metal that represented protection and partnership and possibility. She was married, actually married, to a good man who'd defended her when he had no obligation to, who'd offered her respect when the world offered only judgment. It wasn't the romantic future she'd once imagined, but standing there in the lamplight, with the vast Montana sky beyond her window and the sound of the wind in the eaves, Eleanor thought maybe it was something better. Maybe it was real. The morning after the town meeting, Eleanor woke to find frost on her window and sunlight streaming through the gap in the curtains. For a moment she lay still, disoriented, before remembering. She was married now. The gold band on her finger caught the light, solid proof that yesterday had actually happened, that she'd stood in front of the entire town and claimed her right to exist without apology. She dressed quickly in the cold room and went downstairs to find Caleb already in the kitchen, attempting to start the fire. He looked up when she entered, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the new reality they'd created, awkward and uncertain, but not unwelcome. "You don't have to do that," Eleanor said, taking over the fire starting. "I'm still the housekeeper, marriage certificate or not." "You're my wife," Caleb said quietly. "That changes things." "Does it?" Eleanor struck the match, watching the kindling catch. "We agreed this was for protection, not for all the usual expectations." "I know what we agreed." Caleb leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "But people in town will be watching now, more than ever. They'll be looking for proof that this marriage is exactly what Constance says it is, a sham, a convenience. We need to at least appear like a real married couple when we're in public." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. "Appear how?" "I don't know. The way married people do, standing closer, maybe using first names instead of being so formal, small things that show we're actually partners." He was right, Eleanor knew, but the idea of performing intimacy, even false intimacy, made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She'd spent weeks carefully maintaining distance, establishing boundaries, making sure everyone knew this was purely a working arrangement. Now she was supposed to pretend otherwise. "I'll try," she said finally, "but I'm not good at pretending." "Neither am I." Caleb pushed off from the counter. "So maybe we don't pretend. Maybe we just let things develop naturally, get to know each other as actual people instead of employer and employee." "Is that what we were?" Eleanor couldn't help the slight smile that tugged at her mouth. "Because I distinctly remember you paying me wages." "I'm still paying you wages. Wife or not, you work harder than anyone on this ranch. You've earned it." The conversation felt strange, negotiating the terms of a marriage that already existed, trying to define something that had no clear definition. But before Eleanor could respond, Jack and Tommy came in for breakfast,
their faces bright with poorly concealed curiosity. "Morning, boss," Jack said, then caught himself. "Morning, Caleb. Morning, Mrs. Mercer." "Eleanor is fine," Eleanor said, ladling porridge into bowls. "Nothing's changed except a piece of paper." "Everything's changed," Tommy said with the bluntness of youth. "You stood up to Mrs. Garrett in front of the whole town. You're like a hero now. My sister wants to meet you." "I'm not a hero," Eleanor protested. "I just refuse to be destroyed by gossip." "That's what makes you a hero," Jack said seriously. "Most people don't have that kind of backbone." They ate breakfast with the conversation circling carefully around the previous day's events, each of them trying to establish what the new normal would look like. Afterward, Caleb announced he needed to ride to the north pasture to check on the cattle, and Eleanor found herself automatically preparing supplies for the trip: food, water, an extra blanket in case the weather turned. "You don't have to do that," Caleb said, echoing her earlier words. "I know." Eleanor wrapped the bread in cloth. "But you'll be gone all day, and you need to eat. Unless being married means I'm supposed to stop taking care of practical things." Caleb smiled, a slow expression that softened his weathered face. "No, I guess it doesn't mean that." After the men rode out, Eleanor threw herself into work with almost desperate energy. She scrubbed the kitchen floor, beat the rugs, washed the windows until they gleamed. Physical labor had always been her refuge, the one thing she could control when everything else spiraled beyond her grasp. By midday, the house was spotless, and Eleanor was exhausted, which was exactly what she'd wanted. She was hanging laundry when she heard a wagon approaching. Her first instinct was fear, Constance Garrett coming to continue yesterday's battle. But when she looked up, she saw Mrs. Chen climbing down with a covered basket and another woman Eleanor didn't recognize. "We bring food," Mrs. Chen announced. "For new bride. Is tradition." The other woman stepped forward, younger than Mrs. Chen but older than Eleanor, with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. "I'm Sarah Murphy. My husband runs the feed store. I wanted to welcome you properly and to apologize." "Apologize for what?" Eleanor asked, bewildered by this unexpected visit. "For not speaking up sooner, for letting you stand alone against Constance and her venom. I was at the train platform that first day. I was in the general store when you bought supplies. And I said nothing, did nothing, because I was afraid of becoming her next target." Sarah's voice was thick with shame. "Yesterday, watching you face her down with such courage, I was ashamed of my cowardice. So I'm here now, too late maybe, but here nonetheless." Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes. "You're not too late, and you're not a coward. Constance Garrett is formidable." "She's a bully," Mrs. Chen said flatly. "And bullies only have power because good people stay silent. But yesterday, people spoke. Not everyone, but enough. Things change now." They carried the food inside, bread still warm from the oven, a jar of preserves, a pot of stew that smelled like heaven. Eleanor made tea, and they sat at the kitchen table, three women who would never have been friends in the rigid social structure Constance Garrett maintained, now united by something stronger than class or circumstance. "How did you end up in Ash Creek?" Eleanor asked Mrs. Chen as they drank their tea. "Husband came with railroad, died in accident. I had nothing, no family back in China, no money. So I work, save, buy hotel cheap from man who want to leave. Now I own business, make my own way. People talk, of course. Chinese woman running hotel, taking business from white men. But I keep working, keep being fair, keep showing I belong. Eventually, most people accept." "Most people," Sarah said quietly, "but not Constance." "Constance never accepts anyone who doesn't bow to her," Mrs. Chen said. "That's why she hates you, Eleanor. Not because you lie about age, because you refuse to disappear when she tells you to." Eleanor thought about that, about how her greatest crime had been survival, had been refusing to accept Constance's judgment as final. It seemed absurd that something so basic could be seen as defiance, but perhaps that was how power worked. Those who held it couldn't tolerate anyone who questioned their right to wield it. "She won't stop," Eleanor said. "Yesterday might have undermined her authority, but that just makes me more of a threat. She'll find other ways to attack." "Let her try," Sarah said with unexpected fierceness. "She's not as powerful as she thinks. Half the women in town are tired of her constant judgment and impossible standards.
You showed us yesterday that she can be opposed. That's worth more than you know." They stayed for another hour, talking about the town, the territory, the peculiar challenges of being women in a place where everything was still being built and defined. When they finally left, Eleanor stood on the porch watching their wagon disappear down the road, feeling something unfamiliar and precious, the beginning of friendship. The men returned at dusk, cold and tired but satisfied with their work. Over dinner, Caleb mentioned casually that he'd run into Frank Morrison at the property line, and that Morrison had actually been civil, even going so far as to congratulate him on his marriage. "Guess word's spreading that not everyone agrees with Constance," Jack said, helping himself to more potatoes. "About time, too. Woman's had this town under her thumb for too long." "Power doesn't surrender easily," Eleanor said. "She'll fight back. We need to be prepared for that." "What can she really do?" Tommy asked. "You're married now. Everything's legal and proper. She can't accuse you of anything." "She can make life difficult in 100 small ways," Eleanor said. "Refuse to serve us at the mercantile. Pressure other merchants to do the same. Turn her social circle against us. We need to be smart about this." Caleb looked at her across the table, his gray-blue eyes thoughtful. "You've dealt with people like her before." It wasn't quite a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "My aunt had a rival in Philadelphia, another seamstress who wanted to be the best in the neighborhood. She couldn't compete on quality, so she spread rumors instead. Said my aunt used inferior materials, that her work was shoddy, that she cheated customers. It nearly destroyed the business before the woman's own reputation caught up with her." "What happened?" Tommy asked, leaning forward. Truth came out. One of her own customers discovered she'd been padding her bills and lying about the source of her fabrics. She lost everything: her shop, her reputation, her marriage. My aunt survived, but barely. The damage had been done. "So you're saying we just wait for Constance to destroy herself?" Jack sounded skeptical. "I'm saying we live our lives with integrity and let her reveal her own character through her actions. We don't retaliate. We don't stoop to her level. We just keep being decent people, and eventually the contrast will be clear to anyone watching." It sounded noble when she said it out loud. But that night, lying in her room with the wind howling around the house, Eleanor wondered if she really believed her own advice. Constance Garrett had power, money, and decades of established authority. Eleanor had a marriage certificate and the support of a handful of women who were as vulnerable as she was. It didn't seem like a fair fight. But then again, Eleanor thought nothing about her life had ever been fair. She'd survived anyway. Maybe that was enough. The following week settled into a new rhythm. Eleanor continued managing the household, but there was a subtle shift in how the men treated her. Not with less respect, but with a different kind of respect, acknowledging her position as mistress of the house rather than hired help. Caleb made an effort to include her in decisions about the ranch, asking her opinion on purchases and expenses, treating her like a true partner even though she knew little about cattle or land management. And slowly, carefully, they began to actually talk to each other. It started with small things, Caleb commenting on the sunset while they stood on the porch after dinner, Eleanor asking about his life before the ranch, before Montana. Conversations that went beyond the practical into the personal, peeling back layers to reveal the actual people beneath the roles they'd been playing. Eleanor learned that Caleb had grown up in Ohio, that his father had been a blacksmith who'd drunk himself to death, that Caleb had left at 16 and worked his way west through sheer determination. She learned that he loved the land with a fierceness that went beyond economics, that he could sit and watch the grass move in the wind for hours, that he'd taught himself to read using a Bible he'd won in a card game. Caleb learned that Eleanor's mother had died when she was 12, that her father had remarried quickly to a woman who'd made it clear Eleanor was unwelcome, that she'd gone to live with her aunt and learned to make herself small and useful so she wouldn't be sent away. He learned that she'd wanted to be a teacher once, that she loved poetry, though she'd never tell anyone, that she was terrified of thunderstorms because of a tornado that had destroyed half her childhood town. These conversations happened in fragments, stolen moments between the demands of running a ranch and maintaining a household, but they accumulated, building something that felt almost like intimacy. One evening, about 3 weeks after the town meeting, Eleanor was mending Caleb's shirt when she noticed him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked, self-conscious. "Nothing. Just, you look content.
More than when you first arrived. Eleanor considered this. I suppose I am. This life. It's not what I planned, but it's honest, real. I'm not performing for anyone or pretending to be someone I'm not. That's worth something. It's worth a lot, Caleb said quietly. Then after a pause, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you regret it? Marrying me instead of waiting for another chance at whatever you were hoping to find when you came west? Eleanor set down the shirt, giving the question the weight it deserved. I came west hoping to escape, she said slowly, hoping to find security and respectability, and maybe, if I was very lucky, some measure of happiness. I thought those things came from being chosen, from being wanted by someone who could provide them. But I'm learning they come from something else, from choosing myself, from refusing to accept other people's judgments as truth, from building a life on my own terms even when those terms aren't what I expected. That doesn't answer my question, Caleb said, but he was smiling slightly. No, I don't regret it. Do you? Not even a little bit. The honesty between them was startling, frightening, precious. Eleanor picked up her needle again, but she could feel Caleb's presence across the room like warmth from a fire, steady and safe. In town, the aftermath of the meeting continued to ripple outward. The town council quietly dismissed Constance's complaint, citing lack of evidence of any actual wrongdoing.
Several merchants who'd been following her lead began serving Eleanor and Caleb normally again, though a few stalwarts, including, unsurprisingly, Thomas Garrett at the Mercantile, refused. Eleanor learned to shop at the general store instead, where the proprietor was a practical man more interested in sales than scandal. But Constance wasn't finished. Eleanor heard through Sarah Murphy that Constance was now claiming the marriage was invalid, that Caleb had coerced Eleanor into it, that the whole thing was an elaborate fraud designed to protect both their reputations. She'd even written to the territorial government requesting an investigation into Judge Blackwell's conduct. She's desperate, Sarah said when she visited with the news. She's lost control of the narrative and she's flailing. Desperate people are dangerous, Eleanor said, remembering her aunt's rival and how destructive she'd become when cornered. What can she actually do, though? Sarah asked. The marriage is legal. Judge Blackwell confirmed it. Unless she can prove actual fraud, which she can't, she's just making noise. Eleanor wanted to believe that, but something in her gut warned otherwise. Constance Garrett had built her power over decades. She wouldn't surrender it easily, and she certainly wouldn't let Eleanor escape unscathed. The attack, when it came, was more subtle than Eleanor expected. It started with whispers about Caleb's ranch finances. Someone, Eleanor suspected Constance, though there was no proof, spread rumors that Caleb was deeply in debt, that he'd married Eleanor for her money, laughable considering she'd arrived with $7, that the ranch was failing and would be foreclosed on by spring. The rumors were designed to isolate them, to make other ranchers wary of doing business with Caleb, to undermine his credit and reputation. It's not true, Caleb said angrily, when the banker, a nervous man named Peterson, suggested he might want to secure additional collateral on his loans. My accounts are solid. The ranch is profitable. Where is this coming from? Peterson wouldn't meet his eyes. There's talk, Mr. Mercer. Just talk. But the bank has to be careful about its exposure, you understand. What I understand, Caleb said coldly, is that someone is spreading lies, and you're choosing to believe them without checking actual facts. He stormed out of the bank with Eleanor following, his fury barely contained. This is what she does, he said as they walked to the wagon. She can't attack you directly anymore, so she attacks through me, destroys my reputation and livelihood, and you suffer by extension. We need to prove the rumors are false, Eleanor said. Show people your actual financial records. Make the truth impossible to ignore. You think people care about truth? They care about stories, Eleanor, and Constance tells better stories than we do. He was right, but that didn't mean they were powerless. That evening, Eleanor suggested something that made Caleb look at her like she'd lost her mind. You want to throw a party? He said incredulously. Not a party. A gathering. Something simple, dinner for the neighboring ranchers and their wives. Show them the ranch is thriving, that we're stable and prosperous and not whatever Constance is claiming.
Let them see with their own eyes that the rumors are false. Eleanor, most of these people wouldn't come. They're too afraid of crossing Constance. Then we invite the ones who aren't afraid. Sarah and her husband, Mrs. Chen, the families who supported us at the town meeting. We build our own community instead of trying to force our way into hers. Caleb was silent for a long moment, staring out at the darkening landscape. Then he nodded slowly. All right,
But you'll have to plan it.
I don't know the first thing about hosting. Neither do I, Eleanor admitted, but I can learn.
They held the gathering 2 weeks later, on a crisp October evening when the mountains were painted gold and crimson with fall colors. Eleanor spent days preparing, cooking, cleaning, making sure every detail was perfect. She roasted 2 chickens, made bread and pies, set the table with the best dishes the house possessed. When the guests began arriving, she stood on the porch beside Caleb, her heart hammering with nerves. Sarah and her husband came first, bringing wine and warm smiles. Mrs. Chen arrived with her nephew, a quiet young man who worked at the hotel. Tommy's parents came, his mother looking nervous but determined. Frank Morrison and his wife appeared, to Caleb's obvious surprise. Jack had invited another rancher named Crawford and his family. By the time everyone was gathered, there were nearly 20 people crowded into the house, filling it with warmth and noise and life. Eleanor moved through the evening in a daze of hostess duties, serving food, refilling glasses, making sure everyone was comfortable. But she also watched, and what she saw gave her hope. These people were laughing together, talking easily, treating Eleanor and Caleb like friends rather than pariahs. Constance's influence had limits, and they'd found the edges of it. After dinner, as the men gathered on the porch to smoke and the women helped Eleanor with dishes, Sarah said quietly, "This was brilliant. You're showing everyone that life goes on outside Constance's circle, that there's community beyond her control." "I just wanted people to see we're not what she claims," Eleanor said. "You're showing them more than that. You're showing them an alternative. A way of being that's based on actual connection rather than fear and judgment."
That's powerful, Eleanor.
Later, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Eleanor found Caleb sitting on the porch steps, looking out at the stars scattered across the enormous sky. "You did good tonight," he said as she sat beside him. "Really good." "We did good," Eleanor corrected. "This is both of ours now, the ranch, the reputation, the life we're building." "I wasn't sure," Caleb said slowly, "when I first offered you that job. I thought I was just helping someone in a bad situation. But you've changed everything, Eleanor. This house feels like a home now. The ranch feels like more than just work. You've made it something worth fighting for." Eleanor felt her breath catch. They were sitting close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could smell the soap he'd used to wash up before dinner. The gold band on her finger felt suddenly heavier, more significant. "Caleb," she said quietly, "this marriage—" "I know we said it was just for protection," he interrupted. "Just a legal arrangement, and if that's all you want, that's fine. I meant what I said about not expecting anything, but I need you to know—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I need you to know that somewhere along the way, it stopped being just an arrangement for me. You're not just someone I'm protecting anymore. You're someone I care about, someone I could love if you'd let me." The words hung in the cold night air between them, terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. Eleanor's first instinct was to pull back, to protect herself, to maintain the safe distance that had kept her from being hurt. But then she thought about everything that had happened since she'd stepped off that train, the humiliation, the survival, the slow building of something real from the wreckage of her plans. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of wanting something this much. Every time I've wanted something, it's been taken away or turned into disappointment." "I know, I'm scared too." Caleb turned to face her, his weathered face serious in the starlight. "But maybe being scared together is better than being scared alone." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who'd offered her kindness when she'd expected contempt, who'd defended her when he had no obligation to, who'd married her to protect her, and then somehow made that protection feel like partnership. She saw someone who'd shown her, through actions rather than words, what it meant to be valued. Slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted to, Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him.
It was nothing like the brief, chaste kiss at their wedding. This was real, deliberate, full of all the possibility and fear and hope that had been building between them for weeks.
When they finally pulled apart, Caleb's eyes were wide with surprise and something that looked like joy. "Does this mean—" he started. "It means I want to try," Eleanor said. "I want this marriage to be real, not just legal, but actual. I don't know if I can be what you need, but I want to try." "You're already everything I need," Caleb said, and kissed her again. They sat on the porch steps long into the night, talking about the future in concrete terms now rather than hypotheticals, about the ranch and what they could build together, about the possibility of family someday, though Eleanor was careful to explain her fears about her age and childbearing, about creating a life that was wholly theirs, not defined by anyone else's expectations or judgments. When they finally went inside, Caleb walked Eleanor to her door as he always did, but this time he took her hand. "You know," he said, "at some point, you might want to consider moving into the master bedroom. With me. If you're ready." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. "I might, at some point." "No rush," Caleb said. "We've got time." But Eleanor thought maybe she was more ready than she'd admitted. Not tonight, perhaps, but soon. Because for the first time in her life, she was with someone who saw her completely, saw her mistakes and her strengths, her fears and her courage, and valued her anyway. That was worth more than any romantic fantasy she'd ever imagined. That was real love, built not on illusion, but on truth. Winter came to Montana territory like a declaration of war. The first heavy snow arrived in mid-November, transforming the ranch into a landscape so white and vast it seemed to exist outside of time. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, watching the flakes fall, her hand resting unconsciously on her stomach, feeling the subtle changes her body had been signaling for the past few weeks. She'd moved into Caleb's room a month after their conversation on the porch, and what had started as tentative partnership had deepened into something neither of them had quite expected. Real marriage, real intimacy, real love that grew not from romance but from the daily work of learning to trust another person completely. And now she was almost certain she was pregnant. The thought filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She was 28 years old, the age Constance Garrett had declared too old for childbearing, the age that had made her supposedly worthless as a wife. Part of Eleanor wanted to laugh at the irony. Another part was simply afraid. "You're thinking loud," Caleb said from behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I can hear it from across the room." Eleanor leaned back against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I need to tell you something." She felt him tense slightly, but his voice remained calm. "All right. I think I'm pregnant." The silence that followed stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then Caleb turned her to face him, his weathered face transformed by a smile so wide it looked almost painful. "You're sure?" he asked. "Not completely, but all the signs are there. I've been tired, my monthlies stopped, and this morning I couldn't even look at coffee without feeling sick. Mrs. Chen told me once that's how it starts." "Eleanor," Caleb said her name like a prayer, like something precious and breakable. "A baby. Our baby. Are you happy?" Eleanor needed to hear him say it, needed confirmation that this unexpected development was wanted and not just accepted. Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. He pulled her close, and Eleanor felt the tension she'd been carrying for weeks begin to ease. "But what about you? Are you scared?" "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "I'm 28, Caleb. What if Constance was right? What if I'm too old? What if something goes wrong?" "Then we'll face it together," Caleb said firmly. "But women have babies at 28 all the time. Hell, Mrs. Crawford just had her fourth at 32. You're strong and healthy, Eleanor, and we'll get you the best care we can find." Over the next few months, Eleanor's pregnancy became an open secret in Mrs. Chen confirmed what Eleanor already knew, and Sarah Murphy immediately appointed herself as advisor, arriving at the ranch regularly with advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and stories about her own 3 children that were meant to be comforting but often had the opposite effect. "The important thing," Sarah said during one visit, while Eleanor tried not to panic about the story of a breech birth that had taken 18 hours, "is to stay calm. Stress isn't good for the baby." "Then maybe stop telling me horror stories," Eleanor suggested, and Sarah had the grace to look embarrassed. But the pregnancy also brought unexpected support. Tommy's mother, Martha, came to visit with her daughter, the girl who'd called Eleanor brave on that first terrible day. The daughter, whose name was Anna, was 17 and wide-eyed with curiosity. "I wanted her to meet you," Martha said simply, "to see that it's possible to survive the worst and build something good. To know that women can be strong in ways the Constance Garretts of the world don't understand." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm not sure I'm the best example of strength. Most days I'm just making it up as I go." "That's what strength is," Martha said. "Keeping going even when you're terrified. Anna needs to see that." The girl stayed for the afternoon helping Eleanor with kitchen work and asking questions about Philadelphia, about the journey west, about everything that had happened. When they finally left, Eleanor felt like she'd been given a gift she hadn't known she needed. The knowledge that her survival meant something beyond just herself. But not everyone was pleased about the pregnancy. The news reached Ash Creek quickly, and with it came a fresh wave of gossip. Constance Garrett, apparently, had publicly declared that the timing was suspicious, that Eleanor must have been pregnant before the marriage, that the whole thing was even more scandalous than originally thought. "She's lost her mind," Jack said when he brought this news back from town. "She's so desperate to be right that she's making herself look ridiculous. Nobody believes her anymore." "Some people do," Eleanor said quietly. She was 6 months along now, her belly round and undeniable, and the weight of the baby made everything more difficult. Physical work, sleep, even breathing sometimes. "There are always people who want to believe the worst." "Let them," Caleb said. He'd become almost fiercely protective as the pregnancy progressed, insisting Eleanor rest more, hiring a girl from town to help with heavy cleaning, treating her like she was made of glass. They can believe whatever they want. We know the truth. But Eleanor couldn't quite let it go. Constance's accusations, however ridiculous, ate at her, not because she believed them or cared what Constance thought, but because she understood how powerful repeated lies could become. If enough people heard that Eleanor's child was conceived in scandal, that perception would follow the baby through life. And that wasn't fair. The answer came from an unexpected source. In early spring, with Eleanor 8 months pregnant and feeling like a barn whale in human form, Judge Blackwell came to the ranch. He arrived unannounced, his wagon rattling up the road on a bright March morning when the snow was finally beginning to melt. "Mrs. Mercer," he said when Eleanor answered the door, clearly surprised by her condition. "I apologize for arriving without notice. I need to speak with you and your husband about Mrs. Constance Garrett." They sat in the parlor, Eleanor carefully, given her size, and the judge explained that Constance had indeed filed a formal complaint with the territorial government claiming fraud in their marriage. The complaint had been investigated, and the investigator's report was damning, not of Eleanor and Caleb, but of Constance herself. "It turns out," Judge Blackwell said with barely concealed satisfaction, "that Mrs. Garrett has been using her position to manipulate town business for years. The investigator found evidence of financial impropriety, intimidation of merchants, even interference with the mail to intercept letters that might challenge her authority. Your case brought scrutiny she couldn't withstand." Eleanor stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means Mrs. Garrett is being removed from the town council. Her son Thomas is under investigation for misuse of the mercantile's accounts. Apparently she's been extending credit to her allies and denying it to her enemies with no regard for actual finances. The territorial governor has appointed a new oversight committee, and Constance Garrett's reign over Ash Creek is effectively over." The news should have felt like victory, but Eleanor just felt tired. "I never wanted to destroy her. I just wanted her to leave me alone." "I understand, but sometimes standing up to bullies means they destroy themselves." Judge Blackwell stood. "I wanted you to know also that I've prepared a full documentation of your marriage, dates, witnesses, circumstances, in case there's any future question about legitimacy. Your child will be born to a legally married couple, and there's no ambiguity about it." After he left, Eleanor sat in silence with Caleb, trying to process what this meant. The woman who'd humiliated her, who'd tried to drive her out of town, who'd attempted to destroy her reputation and her marriage, that woman had fallen, not through Eleanor's actions, but through the consequences of her own cruelty. "Do you feel vindicated?" Caleb asked. "I feel sad," Eleanor said honestly. She was so determined to control everything that she destroyed herself. That's not victory. That's just tragedy. You're a better person than me, Caleb said. I'm glad she's gone. Eleanor thought about that as spring transformed the landscape, as the ranch came alive with new grass and returning birds, and the promise of new beginnings. Maybe Caleb was right to feel satisfaction. Maybe she was too soft, too willing to empathize even with those who'd hurt her. But she couldn't quite bring herself to celebrate another person's downfall, no matter how deserved. The baby came on a warm April morning, 3 weeks before Eleanor had expected. She woke with her water breaking and contractions already starting, and Caleb immediately panicked in the way competent men do when faced with childbirth. I'll get Mrs. Chen, he said, already moving toward the door. Caleb, Eleanor grabbed his hand. It's going to be hours yet. Just help me downstairs, get things ready, and then ride for Mrs. Chen and Sarah. We have time. They did have time, but not as much as Eleanor hoped. By the time Mrs. Chen and Sarah arrived with the doctor from Ash Creek, a gruff man named Patterson who'd delivered half the babies in the territory, Eleanor was in active labor, gripping Caleb's hand hard enough to leave marks. You need to leave, Dr. Patterson told Caleb. This is women's work. I'm staying, Caleb said flatly. She wants me here, I'm here. Eleanor would have smiled if she hadn't been in the middle of a contraction that felt like being torn in half. She'd heard the stories, knew what to expect, but knowing and experiencing were entirely different things. The pain was enormous, all-consuming, beyond anything she'd imagined. But so was the support. Mrs. Chen held cool cloths to her forehead and murmured encouragement in a mixture of English and Chinese. Sarah coached her breathing, having been through this herself 3 times. And Caleb stayed beside her, letting her crush his hand, telling her she was strong, telling her she could do this, believing in her when she didn't believe in herself. The labor lasted 7 hours. 7 hours of pain and fear and exhausting work, until finally Dr. Patterson said, "One more push, Mrs. Mercer. Your baby's almost here." Eleanor gathered everything she had left and pushed, and suddenly there was a new sound in the room, a baby's cry, thin and outraged and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl," Dr. Patterson announced, placing the squalling infant on Eleanor's chest. A healthy baby girl. Eleanor looked down at her daughter. Her daughter, that reality almost too big to comprehend, and felt something crack open in her chest. The baby was red-faced and angry, with dark hair plastered to her small head and eyes squeezed shut against the brightness of the world. She was perfect. She was absolutely, impossibly perfect. "Hello," Eleanor whispered. "Hello, little one. We've been waiting for you." Caleb was crying. Eleanor looked up to see tears streaming down his weathered face as he stared at their daughter with an expression of complete wonder. "Can I?" he started. "Of course." Eleanor shifted carefully so he could hold the baby. He took her like she was made of glass, cradling her against his chest with hands that could break horses, but were infinitely gentle with this tiny new life. "She's beautiful," he said. "She's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "She looks like a wrinkled potato," Sarah said with a laugh, but her own eyes were wet. "Give her a few days." After the doctor and helpers had cleaned up and left, after Eleanor had been settled in the bed with the baby in her arms and Caleb sitting beside them both, Tommy and Jack crept in to see the newest member of their household. "What's her name?" Tommy asked in a whisper, as if speaking too loud might break something. Eleanor looked at Caleb, and understanding passed between them. They discussed names, but standing here with their daughter, actually in the world, there was only one name that felt right. "Hope," Eleanor said. "Her name is Hope." "Hope Mercer," Caleb repeated, trying it out. "I like it." "It's perfect," Mrs. Chen said from the doorway. She'd stayed to make sure Eleanor and the baby were both settling well, and now she smiled at the scene before her. Child born from 2 people who refused to give up hope. Yes, very perfect name. The first weeks with Hope were exhausting in ways Eleanor hadn't anticipated. The baby needed to eat constantly, cried for reasons Eleanor couldn't always decipher, and sleep became something Eleanor remembered fondly but rarely experienced. But there was joy too, fierce, overwhelming joy every time Hope opened her eyes, or wrapped her tiny hand around Eleanor's finger, or made the little sighing sound that meant she was content. Caleb was besotted. He'd get up in the night to walk with Hope when she was fussy, would talk to her in a soft voice about the ranch and the cattle and all the things they'd do together when she was older. Eleanor would wake to find him standing by the window with their daughter in his arms, both of them watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. "You're good at this?" Eleanor told him one morning, watching him change Hope's diaper with the serious concentration he usually reserved for fixing fence posts. "I'm terrified every second that I'll break her," Caleb admitted, "but I love her so much it's almost painful. Is that normal?" "I think so." Eleanor took Hope from him, settling into the rocking chair to nurse. "I look at her and think about everything that had to happen for her to exist. All the terrible things, all the humiliation and fear and struggle, it led to this. To her. And I can't regret any of it because without all of that, she wouldn't be here." "Constance Garrett gave us our daughter," Caleb said with dark humor. "If she'd let you marry Thomas, Hope would never have been born." It was true in a strange, roundabout way. Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been on that train platform, desperate, frightened, willing to accept whatever scraps of life were offered. That woman wouldn't have survived what came after. But the woman Eleanor had become, forged by rejection and struggle and the choice to keep going, that woman could not only survive, but build something worth surviving for. News of Hope's birth spread through Ash Creek quickly. Sarah visited regularly, bringing food and advice and relief in the form of watching the baby so Eleanor could sleep. Mrs. Chen came with gifts, tiny embroidered clothes, a jade bracelet for protection, her presence that said more than words about acceptance and family. Even Martha brought Anna and her other children to meet Hope, and Anna held the baby with such tender care that Eleanor found herself crying for no reason she could articulate. But the most surprising visit came 6 weeks after Hope's birth. Eleanor was hanging laundry behind the house, Hope asleep in a basket at her feet, when she heard a wagon approaching. She looked up to see Thomas Garrett climbing down, his expression uncomfortable but determined. Eleanor's first instinct was to grab Hope and run into the house. This was the man who'd let his mother humiliate her, who'd stood silent while Eleanor's dreams were shredded in front of the whole town, but curiosity held her in place. "Mrs. Mercer," Thomas said, staying by his wagon like he understood he wasn't welcome. "I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I needed to come to apologize." Eleanor waited, saying nothing. Thomas took off his hat, turning it in his hands. "What my mother did to you was cruel. What I did, standing by and letting it happen, was cowardly. I told myself I was just trying to keep the peace, that she knew best, that you'd be fine and move on. But I was wrong about all of it." "Why are you telling me this now?" Eleanor asked. "It's been almost a year." "Because my mother lost everything, and watching it happen made me realize how much of my life I've spent afraid of her, afraid of disappointing her, afraid of standing up to her, afraid of being my own person. I let that fear hurt people, hurt you specifically. And I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed to say it." Eleanor looked at this man who might have been her husband in another life and felt nothing but a distant pity. He'd been shaped by Constance just as thoroughly as any of her other victims, trapped in a cage of expectations and fear. "I forgive you," she said, and meant it. "Not because what you did was acceptable, but because I'm tired of carrying anger around. It's heavy, and I have better things to do with my energy." Thomas's face crumpled with relief. "Thank you, truly." He glanced at the basket where Hope was beginning to stir. "Is that your daughter?" "Yes, Hope. She's beautiful. You seem happy, Mrs. Mercer. Happier than I think you would have been with me." "I am happy," Eleanor said, and realized it was completely true. "I hope you find your own happiness, Thomas, away from your mother's shadow." After he left, Eleanor picked up Hope and held her close, breathing in the sweet baby smell of her, feeling the solid warmth of her small body. This was what mattered. Not revenge or vindication or proving Constance Garrett wrong, just this life, this love, this family they'd built from the wreckage of her arrival. Summer came, and with it, the busiest season on the ranch. Eleanor managed the household with Hope strapped to her back or napping nearby, learning to nurse while cooking, to soothe a fussy baby while kneading bread, to function on broken sleep and pure determination. It wasn't graceful or easy, but it worked. Caleb hired another hand to help with the increased work, a quiet man named Samuel, who'd lost his own wife in childbirth the year before. He was drawn to Hope in a way that made Eleanor's heart ache, would ask to hold her sometimes and just sit with her in silence, memorizing her face like he was storing up light against some darkness. "Is he all right?" Eleanor asked Caleb one evening. "He's grieving," Caleb said, "but being around Hope seems to help. He told me once that she reminds him there's still good in the world, still things worth protecting. I think we should let him have that." So Eleanor did, watching Samuel become unofficial uncle to their daughter, part of the strange found family that had formed around the ranch. Jack and Tommy, Mrs. Chen and Sarah, Martha and Anna, all of them woven into the fabric of their lives in ways that felt more real than blood ties ever had. In August, Eleanor took Hope into Ash Creek for the first time since the birth. She'd been avoiding town, not from fear exactly, but from a desire to exist in the safe bubble of the ranch. But Hope needed to be seen by Dr. Patterson for a checkup, and Eleanor refused to let old fears dictate her choices. The town looked the same: dusty streets, false front buildings, the vast sky overhead, but something fundamental had shifted. People nodded to Eleanor as she walked past. Women stopped to admire Hope and congratulate her. The clerk at the general store, the same one who'd escorted her from the train platform, fell over himself to be helpful. And then as Eleanor was leaving the doctor's office, she saw Constance Garrett. The older woman was standing across the street, thinner than Eleanor remembered, her black dress hanging loose on her frame. She was alone. No entourage of supporters, no position of power to command attention. Just an old woman watching the world move on without her. Their eyes met across the distance. Eleanor expected to feel satisfaction, or anger, or some echo of the humiliation she'd endured. Instead, she felt only a strange sadness. Constance had built her entire identity on control and judgment, and now both were gone. What was left? Eleanor shifted Hope higher on her hip and crossed the street. "Mrs. Garrett," she said quietly. Constance's face went through a complicated series of expressions: surprise, shame, defiance, exhaustion. "Mrs. Mercer," she said finally, "your daughter is beautiful." "Thank you. I suppose you've come to gloat, to show me how wrong I was about you." Eleanor looked at this woman who'd tried so hard to destroy her and felt something unexpected, pity mixed with a kind of understanding. "I didn't come to gloat. I came because Hope needed a doctor. But since we're here, I want you to know that I don't hate you. What you did was cruel, but I survived it. More than survived. I built a good life from the ruins you tried to make, and now I have Hope, and I have Caleb, and I have a home. Hating you would just take up space that I'd rather fill with love for them." Constance's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You should hate me. I tried to destroy you." "I know, but you failed, and now we both get to live with the consequences of your choices and mine. That seems like enough." Eleanor turned to go, but Constance's voice stopped her. "I was jealous," the older woman said, the words seeming to tear out of her. "You came here with nothing, no connections, no protection, and you survived anyway. You showed everyone that my approval didn't matter, that people could build lives outside my circle. And that terrified me. Because if you could do it, what did that say about my power? What did that say about me?" Eleanor turned back. "It said you were human, flawed and frightened and desperately trying to control a world that can't be controlled. We're not that different, you and I. We both tried to survive the only ways we knew how. You just happened to have more power to do damage with." "I'm sorry," Constance whispered. "For what it's worth, I'm truly sorry." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "I believe you. And I hope you find some peace, Mrs. Garrett. Carrying all that anger and fear, it must be exhausting." She walked away then, hope warm against her chest, and didn't look back. Behind her, Constance Garrett stood alone on the dusty street, and Eleanor felt the final weight of that chapter fall away. It was done. The woman who'd tried to destroy her was no longer an enemy, just another person struggling with the consequences of their own choices. That evening, standing on the porch with the sun setting behind the mountains and Caleb's arm around her waist, Eleanor felt something settle deep in her chest. This was her life now. This ranch, this man, this child, this vast Montana sky that held infinite possibility. All of it earned through survival, through refusal to disappear, through the simple, stubborn choice to keep going even when everything seemed impossible. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked. Eleanor looked down at Hope, who was awake and watching the play of light across the landscape with wide, wondering eyes. "I'm thinking about irony. I came west to be a mail-order bride, young, presentable, acceptable. I was rejected for being too old, too desperate, too much of a liar. And now I have everything I wanted, just not in any form I could have imagined. I have a husband who loves me, a daughter who's healthy and perfect, a home that's actually mine. All because Constance Garrett tore up that contract." "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best outcomes," Caleb said. "If you'd married Thomas, you'd be miserable right now, trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who couldn't stand up to his mother." "If I'd married Thomas, Hope wouldn't exist," Eleanor said. "And that's impossible to imagine now. She's so completely real, so absolutely herself. How could she not have existed?" They stood in silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to the deep blue of evening. Inside the house, Eleanor could hear Jack and Tommy arguing good-naturedly over something, could smell the stew she'd put on that morning, could feel the solid reality of the life they'd built pressing close around her like shelter. "I saw Constance today," Eleanor said finally. "In town." She felt Caleb tense. "What happened?" "Nothing dramatic. We talked. She apologized. I told her I didn't hate her." Eleanor paused, trying to find the right words. "I think she's broken, Caleb. Really, truly broken. And I felt sad for her, which is strange considering everything she tried to do to me." "That's because you're a good person," Caleb said. "Better than most people would be in your position." "I don't know about that. I just know that carrying anger around takes energy, and I'd rather spend that energy on hope, on us, on building something good instead of tearing down something bad." As the stars began to appear, scattered across the enormous sky like promises, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. The train platform where she'd been humiliated, the mercantile where her contract was torn to pieces, the room at the Excelsior House where she'd decided to survive, the ranch where she'd found not charity, but partnership, the town meeting where she'd stood up and claimed her right to exist, and finally, this moment, this perfect, ordinary moment of standing on her own porch with her family around her and her daughter in her arms. They'd called her too old. They'd called her a liar. They'd tried to make her into a cautionary tale, a warning about what happened to desperate women who dared to want more than they deserved. But Eleanor Mercer, had refused to be anyone's cautionary tale. She'd survived and thrived and built a life that was wholly her own, not because someone had chosen her or granted her permission, but because she'd chosen herself. And now, holding hope against her chest and feeling Caleb's steady presence beside her, Eleanor finally understood what it meant to be home. Not a place that accepted you, but a place you built with your own hands. Not a future given to you, but a future you fought for and earned and made real through sheer, stubborn determination. The woman who'd stepped off that train 10 months ago wouldn't recognize the woman Eleanor had become. But that was all right. Growth meant change, and change meant becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth not because others confirmed it, but because she'd proven it to herself. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "For what?" Caleb asked. "For seeing me when I was invisible, for protecting me when I was vulnerable, for loving me when I didn't think anyone could." "Eleanor." Caleb turned her to face him, hope nestled between them. "I should be thanking you. You came into my life and turned it from existing into living. You made this house a home. You gave me a daughter. You showed me what it means to love someone completely. I'm the lucky one here." "Maybe we're both lucky," Eleanor said, and kissed him while hope squirmed between them, making her displeasure at being squashed known with a small, indignant squeak. They laughed and adjusted their holds, and went inside as the night deepened around them. Inside where Jack had set the table, and Tommy was attempting to slice bread without mangling it completely. Inside where the lamps cast warm light, and the stew smelled like comfort, and the house itself seemed to wrap around them like an embrace. This was not the life Eleanor had planned, but it was better than any plan could have been, because it was real and hard-won and absolutely hers. She'd come west looking for a new name and a fresh start. She'd found something infinitely more valuable: herself, unbroken and unashamed, strong enough to survive rejection and cruel enough to flourish anyway. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Not revenge on those who'd hurt her, not vindication for those who'd doubted her, just this: a life built on her own terms, filled with love she'd earned and joy she'd fought for, and a future that stretched out before her as vast and full of possibility as the Montana sky itself. Eleanor Hayes had come west to disappear into someone else's life. Eleanor Mercer had learned to build her own instead. And that made all the difference.